Hi, it's Pastor Chris with a short introduction to what you're about to see, or maybe more accurately, what you're about to not see. So we recorded this as part of our A Queer Gospel sermon series on June 29th, 2025, and June 29th was a fifth Sunday, and on fifth Sundays, we try to do something a little bit different from the usual form of worship that we have here at First Congregational United Church of Christ in DeWitt. So we met in Fellowship Hall, where we don't have a camera, and we talked about the things that we don't talk about in church, the topics that are a little bit taboo to bring into the sanctuary, or at least that we treat that way. So of course, since there's no camera, there's no video, but we did take the audio from that and kind of cut it together to make something that we hope you will find interesting. So I apologize that you will not really have anything to look at with this video, but at the very least, you can listen and get an idea of how we do some things at First Congregational United Church of Christ in DeWitt. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy. So we have a list of things we don't talk about so much in church. I summarized a few of them, and some of them were pretty similar, so hopefully this captures a lot of what people wrote down. So we have sex and gender, and the sex one said, also the physical act, the thing. Ways to discuss politics, right? So how can we have political conversations nicely and civilly? Theodicy, which is the big fancy word for how do you believe in God when also things are terrible, right? When there is suffering and corruption and all of that stuff in the world, how do you believe in a good and loving God? The federal budget, we could also take that to probably the state and local budgets and government budgets in general. Partisan voting, so how people vote, where we kind of stand on those different things. The people who are missing from the church. Immigration, just plain how hard it is to believe in God. Disabilities, abortion, prison, children, and the pastor. It said the pastor. We don't talk about the pastor. Is there anything else that anybody would want to add to this list of kind of stuff that we just don't talk about in church? Okay, so to bring Ralph's question in, why don't we talk about this stuff in church? Does anybody have any thoughts or ideas on why we tend to avoid these topics and probably some other topics that are like them? Okay, now because I am actually recording this so I can snip something together for the internet, but I'm going to read these off. So we have that it's just not appropriate. Some of these things might make us feel guilty in some way. We're afraid of disagreements, afraid of hurting someone's feelings, afraid we're the only person with that view, afraid of being embarrassed. And of course, we hear about some of this other places all the time, kind of depending on our media diet and the communities that we are in. I am noticing up here a lot of fear. So I think some of them probably make us feel more afraid than others, but some of them also make us feel afraid in different ways. I'm not sure how many of us would be afraid of talking about children, but I can understand being a little afraid about talking about the people who are missing from this church, especially when we're talking about like the people who used to come here, although that used to is getting further and further into the past, and don't so much anymore. And what does that mean when we start talking about like, oh, what does that say about us? What did we do? All that kind of stuff. And then definitely when we start talking about anything having to do with that big, broad category of politics, we get afraid of being the only person in the room who holds a certain view, or being embarrassed about our view, and not necessarily embarrassed in like a bad way, but embarrassed because we're the only person in the room maybe. Or of hurting someone else's feelings, or of just having a disagreement, because a lot of disagreements about things that fall under that political umbrella get heated and end in arguments, and we can be worried then and afraid of losing friendships and losing relationships if we find ourselves on opposed, not necessarily opposite, but opposing ends of things like that. Yeah, so that's a good list of things that we don't so much talk about, and a good list of reasons that we might not talk about. I do want to talk a little bit about kind of a big cultural reason that we tend not to talk about these things. And I'm not going to nerd out entirely about this, even though I could. So there's a big, long history of a trend called secularization, right? So the world becoming more secular. Religion, broadly, and Christianity in particular, not playing as much of a role in public life as maybe it once did. And that was a big change. Part of that big change, at least, took place like 500 years ago. It used to be, once upon a time, that kind of church world and government world and political world and social world were really deeply intertwined. And then there started being this idea, coming mostly from the political world, from kings and princes and emperors, that maybe these two spheres shouldn't share power. But kings and princes and emperors should have power, and religion, insofar as it was something public, is something that they should have power over. And any religion, insofar as they did not have power over it, should be private and personal and just between you and God. It was kind of this play for power, and it pushed a lot of religious stuff into kind of a private space. So you could talk about things that were important to society and the state and politics and all that kind of stuff, or you could talk about religion quietly over here. So that was one big shift that happened, and it happened over the course of centuries. But then we had another shift, especially in mainline churches like Congregational churches, like the United Church of Christ or the United Methodist or the Presbyterian Church or the Episcopal Church or the ELCA or any of those kinds of guys that are kind of just middle of the road. This is what you think of when you think of a church in the 50s. These were churches that had a lot of civic kind of power and pride, right? They were the churches on the square. They were the churches, the reason we use mainline is they were on the main line of the subway, the train, the whatever. Right? You could see them as you were traveling. Like, those are the big churches. Those are the important churches. Those are the churches where important people go. And they were nice and big. And all sorts of folks went there, right? If you were anybody in town, you went to one of those churches. The church on the square, the church with a place of pride. And that meant that they were diverse on a lot of issues, which at the time were often things like the New Deal or segregation. You know, those kinds of issues, or women's right to vote, all those kinds of things. And through time, those sorts of issues have continued, and other ones have come up. But the key thing is, when you've got all this diversity, the way that you keep that diversity and your size, your membership, your bank account, the way that you continue to pay a pastor, maybe other staff members, is you don't talk about things that are divisive among the folks who are in the congregation. Because if you say the wrong thing about the New Deal, or civil rights, or women's rights, Or as we go on forward, the wrong thing about sex and gender and the LGBTQ stuff and budgets and immigration and abortion and disability and prison and all those kinds of things. If you say the wrong thing, if you have the wrong conversation, a bunch of those folks and their offerings might leave. So we got kind of comfortable saying, we're not going to talk about those things. It's safer. It keeps us secure. It makes sure that everything stays well and the institution keeps going. How would you say the institution is doing? Yeah, kind of across the board, church attendance has dropped. Now, at first, that was a drop among mainline Christians like us, and a bunch of evangelicals thought, hey, we're fine, we're doing good, we're towing the line, we're keeping the gospel going, we're all right. Some of them were growing, but then it caught up with them. And we're seeing this kind of precipitous decline. I would say it kind of started in the 50s. Basically, there was, after World War II, church attendance went way up. People loved joining organizations. They were really into it. They had just been part of some big organizations during the war. They're like, let's keep that going. Peaked around 1950 and started this long, slow decline. And then the 90s came, and it dropped off more precipitously. And then the 2000s came, and it kind of plateaued. And then COVID, and it dropped again. And now we're just in that place where on any given Sunday morning. So I want to say this. A lot of people still identify as Christian. A lot of people will still say they are Christian, but on any given Sunday morning, the vast majority of people are not in a church. And on any given weekend, right? Because some folks have Saturday night services and that. But any given time, most people are not in worship. They are not in a church. They aren't really that involved in what is going on. So even though we have decided not so much to talk about these things historically, in the hopes that it would keep us going, we're not being divisive. Everybody will still come. Everybody likes to belong to a club. Everybody likes to belong to a group. People will still show up because we're not talking about these things. We're not being divisive, and we're not having arguments, and we're not having discussions, and we're not hitting hard things, and it's comfortable and nice and easy. We just sing the songs and pray the prayers and pass the peace. That'll keep us safe. That'll keep us going. Even though we have done that stuff, what has happened is that people have checked out. People go elsewhere for whatever needs were being filled through being part of the church. Here is my theory. Here is my theory, and you can disagree with my theory. If you disagree with my theory, let me know. Here is my theory. I think part of what happened when we stopped talking about hard things was we started saying if something is relevant and important and worth discussing and arguing about, worth having those deep conversations about, you do not come here to do that. And as with the rest of secularization, we kind of ended up saying all of the big important stuff is out there. If you want that, find it somewhere else. And we ended up being left with less and less stuff that's important, especially in a world where believing in God is really hard. Where a lot of people aren't thinking, if I don't pray today, I'm missing something. Or if I don't worship this week, I'm missing something. If you don't think there's something else there to miss, and nothing else is being offered, you just don't show up. Does that sound like a reasonable theory? Kind of, we declared ourselves not maybe so relevant to your life. Now, I do want to say it is very nice sometimes to have a place where you don't have to talk about that stuff. Like, I agree with that, and certainly we don't want to talk about it all the time, because it's important to have those breaks and to say, I'm going to a thing where we are not even going to touch some of that stuff. But if we never touch it, then folks aren't going to come here to find it when they're looking for it, and to maybe find those conversations, those discussions, those ideas in a different way than they encounter them out there in the world, where it's one side against the other. Because while we're afraid of this stuff, one of the things that I love about a church, that I love about a community, that I think is true about this community, is we can actually disagree pretty well. Most of the time, if I disagree with someone and we end up talking about it, we just talk about it. And we get to know each other better, and we get to learn about each other some more, and we find ways to help each other. And we accommodate each other, and we make stuff work. And that's a really powerful example of what a church can do that, like, I'm going to date myself here, talk radio cannot. Right? Or a podcast cannot, or cable news cannot, or any of those other things cannot. Part of why I wanted to talk about this, so part of it is the sermon series that we're in. I mean, we're talking about gender and gender identity and sexuality and that kind of stuff, and I know that before, when I have mentioned that in a sermon, there's usually been someone who says, don't preach on that, don't talk about that. That's all you ever talk about. Jeez. It's just constant. But part of it too was, we had a funeral a while ago, and there were grandchildren at the funeral. There usually are. There often are. The grandchildren were part of the family. They were here the whole time. And I don't know if you know this, but funerals are really boring for children. Right? There's a lot of sitting and being solemn and trying to keep it together and wearing uncomfortable clothes. That's also how a lot of adults seem to feel. And so I was trying to have things set so that the kids had something to do. Not as much during the service, although they had the busy bags, and I made sure that the parents knew that the playground was available. But even before and after the service, we had the coloring table set up, we had all that stuff so that the kids had something to do. And as the day wore on, right, as we had the lunch and the lunch finished up, some of the kids discovered that this building is made for running. We have this long hallway, and it is great for running up and down and up and down and up and down. We have this circle that is formed by the doors between Fellowship Hall and the narthex that is great for just going in circles and chasing each other around and doing that. And some parent, as I was walking by, said to one of the kids, "We don't run in God's house." And I thought, that's a little weird. Like, one, the building is made for running. Two, kids are largely built for running. Like, they are well designed for it. There's a lot of energy to burn off, and it's God's house. There's joy here. There's happiness here. There's fun here. Don't we want children to know that it's fun? But it is important to be careful when you are running. We don't run as fast as we can down the hall, not because God doesn't want us to run, but because we might trip and fall over and hurt ourselves, or hurt our brother or sister, or hurt our cousin, or hurt whoever. So we're careful when we're running, but run. Have fun, enjoy, be happy in this place. Because God wants us to be happy. So I guess that's a way of saying, maybe we should try talking about some of these things with some joy. And in case you're worried that talking about some of these things takes us out of the biblical world, out of that scriptural place, out of that place where we can get stuff, I did remember that we had a scripture reading today. I'm going to read you this passage. This is from a book called The Song of Songs. It does not appear in the lectionary. It does not appear, as far as I know, in any lectionary. I looked at a couple. Song of Songs. That construction, that X of X, is a construction in Hebrew that means the best of something. The King of Kings is not the king of other kings. The King of Kings is the best king. The Lord of Lords is not the Lord over other lords. The Lord of Lords is the best Lord. The Song of Songs is not a song that other songs sing. It is the best song. It is the song that all other songs aspire to be. And here's the passage that I chose. See, the whole thing is this conversation between two people. You have ravished my heart, my sister, my bride. You have ravished my heart with a glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace. How sweet is your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice. Your lips distill nectar, my bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue. The scent of your garments is like the scent of Lebanon. A garden locked is my sister, my bride. A garden locked, a fountain sealed. Your channel is an orchard of pomegranates with all choicest fruits. Henna with nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with all trees of frankincense, myrrh, and aloes, with all chief spices. A garden fountain, a well of living water, and flowing streams from Lebanon. Awake, O north wind, and come, O south wind. Blow upon my garden, that its fragrance may be wafted abroad. Let my beloved come to his garden, that he may eat of its choicest fruits. Most of the book is along those lines. And a lot of people have tried to calm it down. A lot of people have said it's a love song between God and Israel. It's a loving conversation between Christ and the church. And maybe it is, but even if you do that, you kind of got to deal with the metaphor that's going on. Because while maybe this book is not about sex, it's not about sex. You know what I'm saying? And it is the best song. There is something about talking about some of these subjects with grace, with love, with mercy, that makes it the best way to talk about them and to be in community and to work together through stuff so that even on these things like sex and gender and politics and budgets and voting and immigration and abortion and disability and prison and childcare and the pastor and how hard it is to believe in theodicy, and I skipped one and I don't remember which one it is. Even on these, we can have better conversations, we can model better conversations, and we can find more ways to be more loving toward others. I know I said this was a conversation, and then I kind of just took it and ran with it. But thank you for listening, and thank you for your contributions to this. I'm going to ask the last question because I am mindful of time. Are there ways that we could, sometimes, not all the time, sometimes, are there ways that we could talk about these things? I'm going to put learn how to talk. Yeah, it is different to talk about immigration as a big abstract thing versus hearing one of our friends from Ukraine talk about their experience coming here and what that was like, or one of our friends from anywhere else. Yeah. Other thoughts? So looking inward and kind of showing some empathy, some sympathy, some being with someone and like, oh, hey, yeah, I do the same thing. And how do we not do that to each other? So I heard in that both discussion versus argument, right? There's a difference between those two things. I'm not sure quite how to capture the other piece, but there is in our media landscape a lot more atomization, right? I can go and just find my opinions repeated to me by an authority figure, which is different from when we had like 3 news stations and your local paper, and that was kind of the option. Not that those were always great, but at least everybody was kind of watching the same stuff instead of curating our little media diets. Yeah. There is kind of thing. So I put total dropout up there, but what I mean by that, is it's not just finding another church. It's just saying no to like the whole thing, or at least not saying yes to the whole thing. Yeah. And there is something there to, it maybe used to be a question of how do I get someone who's going to go to a church to come to this church? But more and more, it's just thinking about church as an option at all. Yeah. Christy, is your hand up or are you just sitting? Oh, and Ralph, I saw you. Sorry. I'll do Christy and then Ralph. Yeah. I am mindful, and then I'm going to close it because we're doing a good job of having a conversation. I had an uncle, he passed away a number of years ago, who he and I disagreed about many, many things. Probably everything. And we would get into debates on Facebook, because that was how you debated people at the time. And the thing is that they were never posts on that, like comments on things, were never short. Right? Now, part of that is we're both good at just talking for a while and writing for a while and getting into it. But it wasn't just here's a sentence and then we're going to argue back and forth in sentences. It was here are paragraphs. Here are my actual thoughts that I had to think about and write about and come up with. And here they are. And then reading all of that and getting kind of the full picture and doing it right. Like conversation doesn't come in sentences. It comes in paragraphs. And so really kind of leaning into that, thinking first, right? How do I organize my thoughts and say this thing that is a whole thing, and then hearing what you have to say that's a whole thing and talking that way. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for that conversation. I hope we continue it and continue to think about how we can talk about some of these things, and especially how we can talk about some of these things in ways that we can maybe invite folks in the community to come and hear things, to hear about experiences, to hear about ideas, to have some conversations in loving and caring and gracious ways, so that we are having these important conversations in places that are loving and caring and gracious, and not just out in the world in our angry-making, blood pressure increasing media diets.